She stepped off that stagecoach with 3 broken ribs, 2,000 stolen dollars, and a man hunting her across 2,000 miles. When the cowboy looked at her and asked just 2 words, "How long?" she broke down crying right there in front of a stranger she was supposed to marry the next morning. But here is what she did not know. That stranger had a secret, too. 7 years ago, he killed an innocent woman by accident. And the man hunting Lillian? He was that woman's husband. What happens when 2 broken people find each other? When the hunter becomes the hunted? And when the truth finally comes out, will it destroy them or set them free? Stay until the end, because the answer will change how you think about forgiveness, about second chances, and about what it really means to find home. This is not just a love story. This is a story about healing, about how the wounds we carry do not have to define us, about how sometimes the person who saves us is just as broken as we are, and about how courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing to stand and fight when running would be so much easier. If you have ever felt trapped, if you have ever wondered whether you deserve happiness after making terrible mistakes, if you have ever searched for a place where you truly belong, this story is for you. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel something real, do me a small favor. Hit that like button so more people can find it. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever found home in an unexpected place? Share this with someone who needs to hear that broken pieces can still become something beautiful. And if you have not already, subscribe and turn on notifications. We have more stories coming that will make you laugh, make you cry, and remind you why you believe in love. The stagecoach lurched over another rut in the road, and Lillian Gray pressed her hand against her left side, biting back the cry that wanted to escape her lips. Every bump sent lightning through her broken ribs. Every breath was a careful calculation. Too shallow and the black spots would dance at the edges of her vision. Too deep and the pain would steal what little strength she had left. She had been traveling for 16 days. 16 days of agony, of fear, of watching over her shoulder for men who might be following. 16 days of clutching the leather satchel that held everything she owned in this world, including the $2,000 that could either save her or damn her. The letter in her pocket crinkled against her chest. She had read it so many times the paper was wearing thin at the folds. Not the letter from Caleb Thornton, the rancher in Montana who had advertised for a wife. That letter was tucked safely in her trunk, its words memorized. He had seemed kind in his writing, thoughtful. He had asked about her interests, told her about his ranch in the mountains, promised her a good life. No, the letter she kept close was the other one, the one that had arrived 3 days before she fled Philadelphia. I will find you, no matter where you run. You owe my family blood. Victor Hartley, her dead husband's brother, a man who believed she had driven Thomas to his death, a man who did not know or did not care that Thomas had broken her ribs the night before he died, that he had pushed her down the stairs because she had tried to take money from his safe, money that was supposed to save her brother's life. The stagecoach crested a hill, and Lillian looked out the window at the vast Montana landscape spreading before her. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in September. The sky was enormous here, bigger than any sky she had ever seen in Philadelphia. The air that drifted through the window smelled of dust and sage and horse leather, so different from the coal smoke and factory stench of the city. For just a moment, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe she had run far enough. Maybe Victor would give up the chase. Maybe this Caleb Thornton would be a good man, a kind man, and she could finally stop being afraid. Then the coach hit another rut, and the pain in her ribs reminded her that hope was a dangerous thing. Montana City appeared below them, a small collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single main street. There was a general store, a saloon, a church with a modest steeple, and at the far end, a boarding house with a painted sign that read Patterson's Rooms. That was where she was supposed to meet him. Mrs. Ruth Patterson had arranged everything through letters, matching mail-order brides with ranchers throughout the territory. Lillian had answered the advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper, desperate for escape. willing to marry a stranger if it meant putting 2,000 miles between herself and Victor Hartley. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the boarding house, and Lillian gathered herself. She pressed her mother's handkerchief against her ribs, the worn cotton soft against her fingers. It was the only thing she had left of her mother, who had died when Lillian was 12, the only thing Thomas had not managed to destroy during their marriage. The driver opened the door and extended his hand to help her down. Lillian moved carefully, every muscle tensed against the pain. She had become expert at hiding it over the past 2 weeks. She knew how to hold her face still, how to breathe in small sips, how to move as if nothing was wrong. But as her feet touched the dusty street, a wave of dizziness swept over her. She swayed, and only the driver's firm grip kept her upright. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Fine," Lillian said, forcing a smile. "Just tired from the journey." The door of the boarding house swung open, and a plump woman in her 50s emerged. She had steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were kind as they swept over Lillian. "Miss Gray? I am Ruth Patterson." "Oh, you poor dear. You look absolutely worn to the bone. Come inside. Come inside." Lillian followed her, moving slowly, always carefully. The boarding house was clean and comfortable, with lace curtains on the windows and the smell of fresh bread drifting from somewhere in the back. Mrs. Patterson ushered her into a small parlor and pressed her into a chair. "Mr. Thornton will be here shortly," Mrs. Patterson said, studying Lillian with sharp eyes. "He has been quite anxious about your arrival. Such a good man, that Caleb. You are fortunate." Lillian nodded, lowering herself into the chair with agonizing slowness. She had no way of knowing if she was fortunate or not. Their correspondence had been brief and practical. He needed a wife. She needed escape. Love had not been part of the equation. "Can I bring you some tea?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Something to eat?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you." Mrs. Patterson bustled off, but Lillian caught the way the older woman's eyes lingered on her, the slight frown that creased her forehead. She knows something is wrong, Lillian thought. She can see it in how I move. She heard boots on the porch before she saw him, heavy footsteps that made her heart race with old familiar fear. When the door opened, she looked up and felt the breath catch in her throat. Caleb Thornton was not what she had expected. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of a man who worked hard every day of his life. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and fell to his collar in waves that needed cutting. He wore a dusty coat over a plain shirt, and there was a gun belt strapped to his hip. But it was his eyes that caught her. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they swept over her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, cold, watchful, assessing her the way a man might assess a threat. He was nothing like his letters. In his letters, he had been warm, thoughtful. This man looked like he had never felt warmth in his life. "Miss Gray," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel over stone. He removed his hat, revealing more of that dark hair, but he did not smile. "I am Caleb Thornton." She started to rise, forgetting to be careful, and the pain hit her so hard she gasped. She sank back into the chair, her vision swimming. She saw his expression change. The cold assessment sharpened into something else. His eyes dropped to the way she held her arm against her side, to the careful, shallow breath she was taking. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside her chair, bringing his face level with hers. This close, she could see a scar that ran along his jaw, could smell leather and horses and something clean like pine soap. "How long?" he asked quietly. The question hit her like a physical blow. 2 words, spoken softly, but they cut through all her careful defenses. He knew. Somehow, this stranger knew. The tears came before she could stop them. They spilled down her cheeks, and she pressed her mother's handkerchief to her face, trying to stifle the sobs that made her ribs scream. "I fell," she managed to say. "On the ship." There was rough weather and I fell down some stairs. His jaw tightened. Those storm cloud eyes held hers, and she saw the moment he decided not to believe her. But he did not push. He did not demand the truth the way Thomas would have. He simply stood and stepped back, giving her space. "Mrs. Patterson," he called, "could you bring that tea now? And something to eat. Miss Gray needs her strength." The older woman appeared in the doorway, her face full of concern. "Of course, right away." Caleb pulled up another chair and sat down, keeping a respectful distance between them. He turned his hat over in his hands, and Lillian noticed that his fingers were calloused, scarred, working hands. But there was something else there, too, a tension in the way he held himself, like a man who was always ready for trouble. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I know this is not what most women dream of, traveling across the country to marry a stranger. I know I am asking a lot." Lillian wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "Thank you for understanding." He nodded, but his eyes never left her face. "The wedding was supposed to be tomorrow. The preacher is expecting us at the church at noon. But if you need time, if you need to rest, we can delay it." "No," Lillian said quickly. "Tomorrow is fine." His eyebrows rose slightly at the urgency in her voice, but again, he did not push. Mrs. Patterson returned with tea and sandwiches. Lillian forced herself to eat a little, though each bite felt like swallowing stones. Caleb watched her with those observant eyes, and she knew he was cataloging everything. The way she moved, the way she flinched when she reached for her cup, the way she held her left arm close to her body. After an hour of careful conversation about the ranch and the territory, Caleb stood. "You should rest," he said. "Mrs. Patterson has a room ready for you. I will come by tomorrow morning." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she could not read. "I'm glad you are here, Miss Gray. Whatever brought you to Montana, I intend to be a good husband to you." After he left, Mrs. Patterson helped Lillian up the stairs to a small but clean room. The older woman's hands were gentle as she helped Lillian remove her traveling cloak. "He is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said. "Lost his parents to fever 5 years back. Been running that ranch alone ever since. Works himself near to death, but he is honest and he is kind." She reached for the buttons on Lillian's dress, and Lillian realized with horror that she could not stop her. The fabric fell away, revealing the cotton chemise beneath, and Mrs. Patterson went very still. The entire left side of Lillian's ribcage was a tapestry of bruises, purple and green and yellow, spreading from her lowest rib almost to her collarbone. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, then red with anger. "Who did this to you?" she demanded. "I told you I fell. That is not from falling." Mrs. Patterson's voice shook. "That is from being beaten." Lillian felt more tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, "please do not tell Mr. Thornton. I need this marriage. If he thinks I am damaged or troublesome, he might send me back." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. She pulled Lillian into a careful embrace. "Caleb Thornton is not the kind of man who would turn away a woman in need," she said. "But these ribs, child, they need proper binding. How long have you been hurt like this?" 2 weeks. Maybe a bit more." Mrs. Patterson made a sound of distress. "You traveled all this way with broken ribs? You could have died." She helped Lillian sit on the bed and began examining the injuries with gentle, practiced hands. "I know something about this," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "My own husband used to beat me, until one night I beat him back with a cast-iron skillet. He did not get up." Lillian stared at her in shock. Mrs. Patterson met her eyes. "Sometimes we have to save ourselves. But sometimes, if we are very lucky, we find someone who helps us do it." She bound Lillian's ribs with strips of clean cotton, working with careful efficiency. The support helped immediately, making it easier to breathe. "You rest now," she said, helping Lillian into bed. "And tomorrow you are going to tell Caleb the truth. Not all of it, if you're not ready, but enough." "What if he does not want me then?" "He will." Mrs. Patterson pulled the blanket up over her. "That man has been alone too long. He needs someone. And I think you need someone, too." After the older woman left, Lillian lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. Wind in the eaves, horses in the street below, someone playing a fiddle in the saloon down the road. She thought about Caleb Thornton and his cold gray eyes, the way he had asked how long in that quiet voice, the way he had given her space instead of demanding answers. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe she had finally run far enough. Maybe this was where she could stop. She fell asleep with her mother's handkerchief pressed against her heart, and for the first time in weeks, she did not dream of Thomas. But across the country in Philadelphia, Victor Hartley was reading a report from a private detective. His thin lips curved into a smile as he traced his finger across a map to a small dot labeled Montana City. "Found you," he murmured, "and you are not going to escape me again." He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write a letter to a man named Silas Kane. The wedding was nothing like Lillian had imagined as a girl. There were no flowers, no music, no guests weeping with joy. Just a small church with plain wooden pews, a preacher who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, and a groom who stood rigid as stone at the altar. Caleb Thornton wore a clean shirt and dark trousers, his hair still damp from washing. He had shaved, and without the stubble, Lillian could see the sharp angles of his face more clearly, the scar along his jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years. When she walked down the aisle, he watched her with that same assessing gaze from yesterday, measuring, calculating. She had the unsettling feeling that he saw everything she was trying to hide. The ceremony was brief. The preacher rushed through the words as if he had somewhere else to be. When he asked if she took Caleb as her husband, Lillian's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I do." When he asked Caleb the same question, the answer came strong and certain. "I do." Then the preacher pronounced them married and closed his book. Lillian waited for the kiss that was supposed to seal the vows, but Caleb simply extended his hand. She stared at it for a moment, confused. Then she understood. He was offering a handshake, a business agreement, nothing more. She took his hand. His grip was firm but careful, and she noticed again how he was always careful with her, as if he knew exactly how fragile she was. "This is a business arrangement," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Until we can trust each other, you will have your own room. The door locks from the inside." Something in her chest loosened at those words. Relief, she realized. He was not going to demand anything from her. Not yet. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, then offered his arm to walk her out of the church. Mrs. Patterson was waiting outside with a small basket of food for their journey. She hugged Lillian carefully, mindful of her ribs. "You take care of yourself," she whispered, "and let that man take care of you too. He will, if you let him." Then they were in Caleb's wagon, leaving Montana City behind. The road wound through rolling hills covered in golden grass, and in the distance the mountains rose up against an endless blue sky. Lillian had never seen so much open space. In Philadelphia, buildings had crowded in on all sides, blocking out the sun. Here there was nothing but land and air and sky. "It is beautiful," she said, forgetting herself for a moment. Caleb glanced at her, and something in his expression softened slightly. "Wait until you see the ranch. My father built the house with his own hands. I have added on over the years. They rode for 3 hours, speaking little." Lillian found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. The way he held the reins with easy competence. The way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, checking for threats. The gun on his hip that he seemed to wear as naturally as his boots. His letters had been warm. This man was a fortress. The ranch came into view as they crested a final hill. A sturdy log house with a covered porch sat in a small valley, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. Horses grazed in a fenced pasture, and cattle dotted the hills beyond. It was isolated, remote. 3 hours from town with no neighbors in sight. Part of her felt a tremor of fear. If this man turned out to be like Thomas, there would be no one to hear her scream. But another part of her, the part that had been hunted and hurt and exhausted for so long, saw something else. Safety. A place where Victor Hartley might never find her. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down. He came around to her side and lifted her down, his hands spanning her waist with that same careful gentleness. He set her on her feet and stepped back immediately, giving her space. "Welcome home," he said. The words were formal, but his voice had that rough edge that made her wonder what he was feeling underneath all that stone. He carried her trunk and carpet bag inside, and Lillian followed slowly. The main room was large and open, with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen area at the other. The furniture was plain but well made. Everything was clean, but there was no softness anywhere. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. A bachelor's home, a lonely home. "Your room is through here," Caleb said, leading her to a door off the main area. The bedroom was small but adequate. A large bed covered with a plain quilt, a dresser, a window that looked out toward the mountains, a lock on the inside of the door, just as he had promised. "I will sleep out here," he said, gesturing to the main room. "You do not need to worry." That night, Lillian lay in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Wind in the grass, the distant lowing of cattle, horses shifting in the corral. And something else. A sound that made her go very still. Caleb was talking in his sleep, or rather crying out. She could hear his voice through the door, muffled but anguished. "Mary. No. Mary, I am sorry. I am so sorry." Then silence. Then the sound of footsteps, of him pacing the main room, of a glass being poured. Who is Mary? Lillian wondered. And what happened to her? She did not sleep well that night. Neither, it seemed, did he. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn to tend the animals, and Lillian did what she could around the house, despite her healing ribs. She cooked meals, which he ate in silence. She cleaned and organized, trying to make the Stark house feel more like a home. He was always careful with her, always distant. On the third day, she tried to help with breakfast, despite the pain in her side. She was reaching for a pot on a high shelf when she heard him come in behind her. Without a word, he stepped close. His chest nearly touched her back. She could feel the heat of him, smell leather and horses in that clean pine soap. His arm reached past her, his breath stirring her hair. He grabbed the pot, set it on the counter, and stepped away without meeting her eyes. Lillian's heart was racing. Not from fear, from something else entirely. "You should not be reaching like that," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You will hurt yourself." "I'm fine." He turned to look at her then, and she saw something flicker in those gray eyes, something almost like frustration. "You keep saying that." He stepped closer, and for the first time there was heat in his voice. "You keep saying you are fine when anyone with eyes can see you are not. Your ribs are broken. I know what broken ribs look like. I know how they feel. So stop telling me you are fine." Lillian felt tears pricking at her eyes. "How do you know what broken ribs feel like?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I was not always a rancher." He turned and walked out, leaving her with more questions than answers. That afternoon, while Caleb was out checking the cattle, Lillian explored the barn. It was a large structure, well built and well maintained. Horse tack hung on pegs along one wall. Tools were organized neatly on shelves. In a back corner, behind some old saddles, she found a trunk. It was dusty, clearly not opened in years. She knew she should not look inside. It was not her place. But something drew her to it, some instinct she could not name. She lifted the lid. Inside, she found clothes, a long coat, worn and patched, a wide-brimmed hat, and beneath those, papers, posters. The first one made her blood run cold. "Wanted, Silas Kane, $500 reward, for robbery and murder." The poster showed a hard-faced man with cold eyes. Beneath it was another poster. This one was torn, faded, but she could make out partial words. Caleb Thorne and Bounty Hun. Lillian sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Caleb had been a bounty hunter, a man who hunted outlaws for money. That explained his watchfulness, his skills, the gun he wore so naturally. But why had he stopped? And who was Silas Kane? She put everything back exactly as she had found it and returned to the house, her thoughts churning. That night at dinner, she watched him more carefully than before. The way he positioned himself so he could see the door. The way he kept his gun within reach even while eating. The way his eyes flickered to the windows at the slightest sound. This was not a man who had simply walked away from his past. This was a man who was still watching for it to catch up with him. After dinner, she asked, "May I ask you something?" He nodded, waiting. "Your letters were warm, kind, but you are not like your letters at all. Why?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mrs. Patterson wrote most of those letters. I told her what I wanted to say, and she put it into words that would not frighten a woman off." He paused. "I am not good with words, never have been. But I meant everything in those letters, even if I cannot say it the same way." Lillian considered this. And the distance? The coldness? He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something vulnerable beneath the stone. "I do not know how to be close to someone anymore," he said. "I have been alone a long time. And before that, I did things that do not make for good conversation." "What kinds of things?" The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by that familiar wall. "Things I am not ready to talk about." He stood and began clearing the dishes. "You have your secrets, Miss Gray. I have mine. Maybe someday we will trust each other enough to share them. But not yet." He was right, of course. She had secrets too. The money hidden in her trunk. The real reason her ribs were broken. The man who was hunting her across 2,000 miles. That night, she heard him screaming again. "Mary, Mary, I am sorry." She lay in the darkness, pressing her mother's handkerchief to her chest, and wondered what ghosts haunted Caleb Thornton, and whether hers would catch up with her before she could find out. A week passed. Then 2. Her ribs began to heal. So did something else. She found herself looking forward to his footsteps on the porch each evening. The way he would nod at her when he came in, checking to make sure she was all right. The rare moments when his expression would soften, when she would catch a glimpse of the warmth that had been in his letters. He was teaching her to ride. She was terrible at it, but he was patient, his hands steady on the reins as he led her horse around the corral. One afternoon, she lost her balance and started to fall. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms coming around her, pulling her against his chest. For a moment, neither of them moved. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, could smell that clean pine scent of him, could feel the strength in his arms holding her like she was something precious. Then he set her on her feet and stepped back, his jaw tight. "We should stop for today," he said. "Your ribs are not ready for this." But she had seen it, the flash of something in his eyes before he looked away. He was not as cold as he pretended to be. There was fire underneath all that stone, and for the first time since Thomas, she found herself wanting to feel it. 2 weeks into her marriage, and Lillian was starting to understand the rhythms of life on the ranch. Caleb was up before dawn, tending the animals, checking fences, doing the 100 small tasks that kept the place running. She rose with him now, making coffee and breakfast, watching through the window as he worked in the gray morning light. They had developed a language of small gestures, a nod when he came in for meals, a slight touch on the shoulder when he passed her in the kitchen, a moment of eye contact that lasted just a beat too long. He was still distant, still guarded, but she was starting to see the cracks in his armor. She saw them in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, in the tremor in his hands when he touched her, however briefly, in the way his voice softened when he said her name. And she saw them in his nightmares, every night, the same tortured cries. "Mary, I am sorry. I am so sorry. One morning she gathered her courage and asked, "Will you teach me to shoot?" He looked at her with something like surprise. "Why?" "Because I'm alone here all day. Because you cannot always be here to protect me. Because I am tired of being helpless." He studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." He took her out behind the barn where he had set up targets on fence posts. He handed her a smaller pistol than the one he wore. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "It will fit your hand better." He stood behind her, showing her how to hold the weapon. His chest pressed against her back, his arms bracketing hers, his hands guiding her grip. She could feel his breath on her neck, warm and steady. "Relax your shoulders," he said quietly. "Breathe out and squeeze the trigger. Do not jerk it." She fired. The shot went wide, but the recoil was manageable. "Again," he said. She fired again. "Closer this time." "Good. You are learning." They practiced for an hour, and by the end she was hitting the targets more often than she missed. But what she would remember most was not the shooting. It was the feel of him behind her, solid and warm. The way his voice dropped low when he leaned close to correct her stance. The way his hands lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. When they finished, he stepped away, and the cool air rushed in to fill the space where his warmth had been. "You did well," he said. "We will practice more tomorrow." That night, the weather changed. The temperature dropped sharply, and clouds rolled in over the mountains, heavy and dark. "Storm coming," Caleb said, studying the sky. "A bad one. We need to check the line cabin up in the north pasture. Make sure the roof is sound before the snow hits." "I can go with you," Lillian said. He shook his head. "It is too far, and if the storm hits while we're out there, we could be trapped." She lifted her chin. "I am your wife. I should learn the land. And you said yourself I need to stop being helpless." He looked at her for a long moment. Something flickered in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or admiration. "All right," he said. "But if I tell you to do something, you do it. No questions." They rode out at midday, the horses picking their way up into the foothills. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Lillian was grateful for the heavy coat Caleb had given her. It smelled like him, pine and leather, and something uniquely his. The line cabin was a small structure barely bigger than a shed, perched on a ridge overlooking the valley below. By the time they reached it, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. "We need to work fast," Caleb said. They checked the roof, patched a few weak spots, stacked firewood inside, but the storm was faster than they expected. Within an hour, the snow was falling so thick they could barely see their hands in front of their faces. "We cannot ride back in this," Caleb said. His jaw was tight with frustration. "We will have to wait it out." The cabin was tiny. One room with a crude fireplace, a single bed built into the wall, a table, and 2 chairs. Caleb got a fire going while Lillian unpacked the food they had brought. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. "This could last all night," Caleb said, "maybe longer." He looked at the bed, then at her. "I will sleep on the floor. Do not be ridiculous. It is freezing." Lillian heard the words coming out of her mouth and could not quite believe she was saying them. "We can share the bed, just to stay warm." He went very still. "Miss Gray, it is Mrs. Thornton now," she reminded him. "And I am not suggesting anything improper. But if we freeze to death, it will not matter much whether we were proper or not." Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen anything close to humor from him. "Fair point," he said. They ate a cold supper, and then, as the temperature dropped further, they lay down on the narrow bed together. Lillian was acutely aware of every inch of space between them. The bed was so small there was barely any. She was wearing all her clothes, and he was wearing his. But still she could feel the heat of his body, could hear his breathing in the darkness. "Tell me something," she said. "Something about you that I do not know." He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, I have not shared a bed with anyone in 7 years. Her breath caught. 7 years? Not since before I came to Montana, before I started the ranch. What happened 7 years ago? She felt him tense beside her. Everything, he said, and nothing. I will tell you someday, but not tonight. She did not push. Instead, she said, "Can I tell you something?" Yes. These past 2 weeks I have felt safer than I have felt in 5 years, since the day I married Thomas. Silence. Then, your first husband, the one who hurt you. It was not a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. He died 2 months ago. An accident at the factory where he worked. They said he was drunk and fell into the machinery. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Were you sorry? Lillian thought about the question. The honest answer surprised her. I was relieved, she said. And then I felt guilty for being relieved. And then I was terrified, because his family blamed me. His brother Victor, he believed I drove Thomas to drink, that I was a bad wife. He swore he would make me pay. She felt Caleb's hand move in the darkness, finding hers, his fingers laced through hers, warm and strong. He will not touch you, Caleb said, not while I am alive. They lay there in the darkness, hands clasped, listening to the wind howl outside. Lillian felt something shift between them. A wall coming down. A bridge being built. I have not talked this much in years, Caleb said. Maybe ever. Me neither, Lillian admitted. Thomas did not like me to talk. He said my voice gave him headaches. Thomas was a fool. The simple words spoken with such conviction made her eyes sting with tears. Caleb, she said, using his first name for the first time. Thank you. For what? For being nothing like him. She did not remember falling asleep. But at some point in the night, the cold must have driven them closer together, because she woke with her head on his chest and his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. She should have been afraid, should have pulled away. Instead, she lay there listening to his heartbeat, feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life. Then the nightmare started. Caleb's body went rigid, his breathing turned ragged, and then he started to cry out. Mary, no, God, no, Mary, I am sorry. Please, I am so sorry. His voice was raw with anguish, with guilt, with a pain so deep it made Lillian's chest ache. She touched his face, trying to wake him gently. Caleb, Caleb, wake up, you are dreaming. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a moment he did not seem to know where he was. Then his gaze found her face, and she saw the exact moment he came back to himself. He pulled away from her, sitting up, pressing his back against the cabin wall. His chest was heaving. I am sorry, he said. I should not have. I did not mean to. It is all right. She sat up too, keeping some distance between them. You were having a nightmare. He ran his hands through his hair. It happens sometimes. Every night, Lillian said quietly. I hear you through the door. He went very still. Who is Mary, Caleb? The silence stretched out between them. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the wind dying down to a whisper. Someone I killed, he said finally. His voice was flat, dead. Someone who did not deserve to die. Lillian felt her heart stop. I was not always a rancher, he continued, not looking at her. I was a bounty hunter. I tracked outlaws for money. I was good at it. Too good. He paused, and she saw his hands clench into fists. 7 years ago, I was tracking a man named Silas Kane. Murderer, thief, the worst kind of outlaw. The chase led through the woods at night. I saw movement in the trees. I fired. His voice broke. It was not Silas. It was a woman. She had been hiding in the woods, running from something. I did not know what. By the time I got to her, she was dying. She was pregnant. Oh, Caleb. She died in my arms, he said. Asked me to tell her husband she was sorry. Then she was gone. I never found out who her husband was. I could not face it. I buried my badge the next day and never hunted again." Lillian was silent, trying to process what he had told her. This man, this careful, gentle man, had killed an innocent woman by accident, had carried that guilt for 7 years. "It was an accident," she said finally. "Does that matter?" His voice was bitter. "She is still dead. Her baby is still dead. Because I pulled a trigger without knowing what I was shooting at." Lillian reached out and took his hand. He tried to pull away, but she held on. "Listen to me," she said. "I lived with a man who hurt me on purpose, every day, for 5 years. He enjoyed it. He smiled when he made me cry." She squeezed his hand. "You made a terrible mistake. But it was a mistake. You did not mean to hurt anyone. You are not the same as Thomas. You are not the same as the men who beat their wives and call it love." Caleb looked at her then, and she saw the depth of his pain, the weight he had been carrying alone for so long. "How can you say that?" he asked. "You barely know me. I know enough. I know you gave me my own room and a lock on the door. I know you have not touched me without permission. I know you have nightmares about a woman who died 7 years ago." "A monster would not have nightmares, Caleb. A monster would not care." Something shifted in his expression. The wall behind his eyes cracked just a little. "You are the first person I have told," he said. "The first person who knows." "Then let me be the last person you need to tell," she said. "It stays with me." The storm had passed by then. Pale sunlight was filtering through the cabin window. They could leave now, go back to the ranch, go back to their careful distance. But neither of them moved. "Lillian," Caleb said, and her name sounded different on his lips now, more real, more intimate. "Yes? I think I am starting to understand why you answered that advertisement, why you traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "You were running from something." He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And I think you were running toward something too, even if you did not know what it was." "I still do not know," she admitted. "Maybe we can figure it out together." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, soft and gentle. Then he pulled back and stood, offering her his hand. "We should head back before anyone comes looking for us." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Warmer, closer. Something had changed between them in that tiny cabin, something that could not be unchanged. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Caleb suddenly reined in his horse. "Wait," he said. "What is it?" Lillian looked down at the house and felt her blood run cold. There was a man sitting on the porch, a stranger. "Stay behind me," Caleb said, his hand moving to his gun. They rode down slowly, and the man stood as they approached. He was well dressed with a carefully trimmed beard and eyes that swept over Lillian with obvious interest. "Good morning," the man said. "I am looking for a woman from Philadelphia. Name of Lillian Gray." Caleb stopped his horse and dismounted in one smooth motion. He positioned himself between the stranger and Lillian. "There is no one here by that name," he said. "This is my wife, Lillian Thornton. State your business or get off my land." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My apologies. I must have the wrong place." He tipped his hat and started toward his horse, then paused. "Such a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Thornton. I hope we will see each other again soon." He rode away, and Lillian did not realize she was shaking until Caleb came to help her down from her horse. "You know him?" Caleb asked. "No, but I know who sent him." "Victor," Caleb said. She nodded. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, the strength in his body. "He will not touch you," Caleb said. "I swear it. Whatever it takes, I will keep you safe." Lillian buried her face in his chest and believed him. But far away, the man was composing a message in his head. "Message for Victor Hartley. Found your sister-in-law. She is married to a rancher named Caleb Thornton. She is using his name now. Thornton. What do you want me to do?" And in Philadelphia, Victor Hartley was reading a letter and smiling. "Caleb Thornton," he murmured. Used to be a bounty hunter, according to my sources. This is going to be even more satisfying than I thought. He picked up his pen and wrote a name on a fresh sheet of paper. Silas Kane. In the days that followed the stranger's visit, something changed between Caleb and Lillian. The careful distance they had maintained was gone. In its place was something warmer, more urgent. They had shared their secrets in that line cabin. They had seen each other's wounds. And now they moved around each other like two people learning a new dance, close but careful. Caleb still slept in the main room. Lillian still had her room with the lock on the door. But the lock stayed unused now. And sometimes, when the nightmares came, she would hear him crying out and go to him, sitting beside him in the darkness, until the terror passed. They did not speak of what was growing between them, but they both felt it. One evening, Caleb came in from the barn and found her standing at the window, watching the sun set over the mountains. He came up behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I need to tell you something," he said. "What is it?" "I sent a message to the sheriff in town, told him about the man who came asking questions. If anyone else comes looking for you, he will let me know." Lillian turned to face him. "You did that for me? I did it for us." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek. "Whatever is coming, we face it together. Caleb, I need to tell you something too." He waited. "The money." She took a deep breath. "I did not just take it from Victor. I stole it from the family safe. Thomas caught me the night before he died. That is why he broke my ribs. He pushed me down the stairs and then he beat me, and the next day he went to work drunk and fell into the machinery." She saw something flicker in his eyes, not judgment, something else. "How much?" he asked. $2,000. "That is a lot of money. It was supposed to save my brother. He has a gambling problem. He owed money to dangerous men. They were going to kill him if I did not pay." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is the money now?" "In my trunk, hidden in the lining. Show me." She led him to her room and pulled out the trunk. With trembling hands, she opened the false bottom and pulled out the leather pouch. Inside were stacks of bills, more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Caleb looked at it, then looked at her. "That is why Victor is hunting you. Not just because he blames you for Thomas. Because you took his money." "Yes." "And your brother, did you pay his debts?" "I sent him half before I left Philadelphia. The other half I kept, in case I needed to run again." Caleb reached out and took her hands. "Lillian, look at me." She met his eyes. "A man who beats his wife is not a man. Whatever you took from that family, they owed it to you 100 times over. I do not care about the money. Do you understand? I do not care where it came from or what you did to get it. But I am a thief. You are a survivor. There is a difference." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. She could feel his heart beating against her cheek. "We keep the money," he said. "We use it if we need to. And we do not let Victor Hartley take anything else from you." That night, for the first time, Lillian did not go to her own room. She stayed with Caleb in the main room, curled up beside him on the narrow bed he had made for himself by the fire. They did not do anything more than hold each other. But it was enough. More than enough. A week later, Mrs. Patterson came to visit, bringing news from town. "That man who was asking about you," she said, her face serious. "He left town the day after he came out here. But he sent a telegram before he went. To Philadelphia." Lillian felt her stomach drop. "There is more," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Someone else arrived yesterday, asking questions about Caleb." Caleb went very still. "Who?" "A man named Silas Kane." The name hit Lillian like a physical blow. She remembered the wanted poster she had found in the barn. Silas Kane. $500 reward. Robbery and murder. She looked at Caleb and saw all the color drain from his face. "Where is he now?" Caleb asked. "Staying at the hotel." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were sharp with concern. "I remember that name, Caleb. You were hunting him 7 years ago." Before you quit. Caleb nodded slowly. What is he doing here? Lillian asked. I do not know, but I intend to find out. The next morning, Caleb rode into town. He told Lillian to stay at the ranch, to keep the doors locked and the gun close. She did not argue, but she spent the whole day at the window watching the road. He came back at sunset, his face grim. I found him, he said. We talked. What did he say? He said Victor Hartley hired him. $5,000 to bring you back to Philadelphia alive. Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. $5,000 was a fortune. Men would kill for that kind of money. But that is not all, Caleb continued. He knows who I am, what I did. He knows about Mary. How? Because Mary was his wife. The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. Mary, the woman Caleb had killed, the pregnant woman who had died in his arms. His wife. But you said you never found out who her husband was. I did not. Until today. Caleb's voice was hollow. 7 years ago, I was chasing Silas Kane. Mary was hiding in the woods. I thought she was Silas. I shot her. He looked at Lillian with haunted eyes. She was running from him, from her own husband. She was trying to escape, and I killed her. Lillian struggled to understand. Silas was her husband, and now he is here working for Victor? Yes. And he does not just want the bounty money, he wants revenge. For Mary, for the baby. He has been looking for me for 7 years. What is he going to do? He said he's not going to kill me. That would be too easy. He said he's going to take everything I have. The ranch. My peace. And then he's going to take you. No. Lillian's voice was fierce. No, he is not. Caleb pulled her close. I will not let that happen, whatever it takes. That night, they made a plan. They would fortify the ranch, stock up on supplies, send word to the sheriff, and they would not let Silas Kane or Victor Hartley win. But as Lillian lay awake in the darkness, listening to the wind moan outside, she could not shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, something that would test them both to their limits. 3 days later, Silas Kane came to the ranch. He rode up in broad daylight alone as if he had nothing to fear. Caleb met him on the porch with a rifle in his hands. Get off my land, Caleb said. Silas smiled. It was a cold, terrible smile. Now is that any way to greet an old friend? We were never friends. No, Silas agreed. We were not. You hunted me like an animal. And then you killed my wife. That was an accident. Was it? Silas dismounted and walked closer, apparently unconcerned by the rifle pointed at his chest. You know what I think? I think you saw her and you did not care. One more body, one more notch on your belt. You are wrong, am I? Silas stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I have spent 7 years thinking about that night, about how Mary died, about the baby that never got to take its first breath. And I have decided that you do not get to just walk away. You do not get to start a new life with a pretty wife and pretend none of it happened. What do you want? I want you to suffer. Silas's voice was calm, almost pleasant. The way I suffered. I want you to lose everything you care about. And then, when you have nothing left, I want you to remember that this is what you deserve. He turned and walked back to his horse. I will be seeing you, Caleb. He mounted up and tipped his hat. And you, Mrs. Thornton, real soon. He rode away, and Lillian came out onto the porch. She took Caleb's hand. What are we going to do? Caleb's jaw was tight. We fight. Whatever it takes, we fight. That night, the barn caught fire. They saved most of the horses, but the structure was a total loss. Caleb worked through the night, beating back the flames, his face black with soot and sweat. In the morning, they found a note nailed to the front door. One thing each day, until there is nothing left but her. Lillian stared at the note, then looked at Caleb. He wants to break us, she said. He wants us to be afraid. Are you? She thought about it, really thought about it. About Thomas and the years of fear. About running across the country with broken ribs. About all the times she had felt helpless and small. No, she said finally. I am tired of being afraid. I am tired of running. She grabbed Caleb's shirt and pulled him close. "Teach me to fight," she said. "Really fight, not just shooting at targets. Lillian, I have been running my whole life, from my aunt who did not want me, from Thomas, from Victor. I am done running." She met his eyes. "Teach me to stand." Something shifted in his expression. Pride, maybe, or admiration. "All right," he said. "If that is what you want, I do not just want it. I need it." And so he taught her. Not just shooting, but everything. How to move quietly, how to watch for threats, how to use a knife if she had to. He taught her the way he had learned, back when he was a bounty hunter, back when his life depended on being faster and smarter than the men he hunted. She was a good student, better than he expected. "You have good instincts," he told her one evening after a particularly grueling session. "You know how to read people, how to see what they are really thinking." "I learned that from Thomas," she said. "When you live with someone who hurts you, you learn to watch their moods, to see the anger coming before it hits. That should not be a skill anyone has to learn." "No, but I have it, and now I am going to use it against people who deserve it." They stood there in the fading light, two damaged people who had found something in each other that neither had expected, something that felt suspiciously like hope. "Caleb," Lillian said. "Yes? I think I am starting to understand something." "What?" "Why I answered your advertisement. Why I came all this way." She reached up and touched his face. "I was not just running from something. I was running to something. To you." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I have been waiting for you," he said. "I did not know it, but I have been waiting for you my whole life." He kissed her then, not the gentle, tentative kisses they had shared before. This was something more, something that spoke of hunger and need and all the years of loneliness that had led them to this moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lillian said, "Whatever happens with Silas, with Victor, I want you to know something." "What?" "I do not regret coming here. Not for a single moment." He pulled her close. "Neither do I." But even as they held each other, they both knew the storm was coming. Silas Kane was out there, watching, waiting, and Victor Hartley was pulling strings from 2,000 miles away. The battle was just beginning. 1 month had passed since Lillian arrived in Montana, and everything had changed. Her ribs were healed, the bruises had faded, and somewhere along the way, without quite realizing it, she had fallen in love with Caleb Thornton. It happened in small moments. The way he brought her coffee in the morning, already fixed the way she liked it. The way his eyes followed her across the room. The way he said her name, soft and low, like it was something precious. They had not consummated their marriage. Not yet. There was still too much between them, too much fear on her side, too much guilt on his. But they slept in the same bed now, tangled together through the night. And when the nightmares came, they held each other through them. They had not seen Silas Kane since the night of the fire. But they both knew he was out there, watching, waiting. The waiting was almost worse than the attacks. "There is a dance in town this Saturday," Caleb said one evening. "Mrs. Patterson told me about it. She thinks we should go." Lillian looked up from the bread she was kneading. "A dance? It would be good for us, to be seen together, to let people know we are not hiding. Is that the only reason?" He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Number." He pressed a kiss to her neck. "I want to dance with my wife." A thrill ran through her at the possessive note in his voice. "My wife." He said it differently now than he had at first, like he meant it. "I do not have anything to wear to a dance. Mrs. Patterson said she has a dress you can borrow, one that will fit. You planned this already. I am a thorough man." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "All right, let us go to a dance." Saturday came bright and clear. Lillian spent the afternoon getting ready at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house while Caleb waited outside. The dress was blue silk, nothing fancy by Philadelphia standards, but prettier than anything she had worn in years. Mrs. Patterson helped her pin up her hair and found a pair of earrings to lend her. When she came down the stairs, Caleb was standing in the parlor. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and she saw his expression change. His eyes went wide, then soft, then hungry. "You look," he started, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "You look beautiful. Thank you." She felt heat rising in her cheeks. "You look rather handsome yourself." He was wearing a dark suit that fit him well, and he had trimmed his hair and shaved. Without the rough edges, he looked almost civilized. Almost. But his eyes were the same, gray and intense and burning, with something she was just beginning to understand. The dance was held in the town hall, a large wooden building decorated with bunting and lanterns. Half the county seemed to be there, and Lillian was acutely aware of the stares and whispers as she walked in on Caleb's arm. The mail order bride. "Did you hear about the fire at the Thornton place? Who is that man they say is after them?" She held her head high and did not let the whispers touch her. The music was provided by a trio of fiddlers, and the dancing was lively. Lillian had not danced in years. Thomas had not liked dancing, had not liked her having fun of any kind. But when Caleb led her onto the floor and pulled her into his arms, she remembered how good it felt to move with the music, how alive it made her feel. They danced 3 songs in a row, and by the end she was laughing and breathless. "I need some air," she said. He nodded and went to get her a drink while she stepped outside onto the porch. The night was cool and clear, the stars bright overhead. Lillian leaned against the railing and breathed deeply, feeling happier than she had in longer than she could remember. "Mrs. Thornton?" She turned to find a man standing behind her. He was young, perhaps 28, with fair hair and a charming smile. His clothes were expensive, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never known hardship. "I do not believe we have met," he said. "I am Emmett Cole. My ranch borders your husband's property to the east." Lillian remembered the name. Caleb had mentioned him, a wealthy neighbor who had inherited his land rather than working for it. "A pleasure to meet you," she said carefully. "The pleasure is mine." He came to stand beside her at the railing, too close for comfort. "I have been wanting to introduce myself ever since I heard Caleb had gotten married. I must say, you are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone." He paused, less refined. "Caleb is not known for his appreciation of the finer things." Something about his tone made her uncomfortable. "He may surprise you." "Oh, I am sure he is full of surprises." Emmett smiled, but there was something sharp beneath the charm. "For instance, I was very surprised to hear about the fire at your barn. Such a terrible accident." Lillian went very still. "Yes, terrible. And the cattle that died the night before, so unfortunate." "Mr. Cole, what exactly are you suggesting?" Before he could answer, Caleb appeared in the doorway. His eyes swept over the scene and his expression hardened. "Cole," he said flatly. "Thornton." Emmett's smile did not waver. "I was just introducing myself to your lovely wife. She is quite a prize. You are a lucky man." "I know." Caleb crossed to Lillian and put his arm around her waist. The gesture was possessive, unmistakable. "If you will excuse us," he said. "My wife promised me another dance." He led her back inside, and Lillian felt the tension radiating from him. "What is it?" she asked. "I do not trust that man." "Why not?" "Because he is a snake. He has been trying to buy my land for years, and now suddenly, right after Silas Kane arrives in town, he wants to introduce himself to my wife? You think they are working together? I think it would not surprise me." They danced again, but the joy had gone out of the evening. When they finally left the dance, Lillian was exhausted. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The moon was high, casting silver light over the hills. As they crested the final ridge and the house came into view, Caleb suddenly pulled up his horse. "Wait here," he said. "What is it?" "Something is wrong." Lillian looked at the house and felt her heart stop. The front door was standing open. Caleb drew his gun. "Stay behind me." They approached slowly, cautiously. Caleb dismounted and climbed the porch steps, his movements silent and controlled. Lillian stayed on her horse, her hand on the small pistol Caleb had given her. He disappeared inside. She waited, her heart pounding. Then he reappeared in the doorway. "It is clear," he said. "But you need to see this." She followed him inside and stopped short. The house had been ransacked. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor. The bedroom, her bedroom, had been torn apart. But that was not the worst part. On the wall, written in what looked like blood, were 4 words. "She belongs to me." Lillian felt her knees go weak. Caleb caught her before she could fall. "Silas," she whispered. "Yes, he knows. He knows everything. Where we keep things, where I sleep. He has been watching us." Caleb's jaw was tight with fury. "He wants us to be afraid. I am afraid." He cupped her face in his hands. "Look at me. Lillian, look at me." She met his eyes. "He is not going to win. Do you understand? He can burn our barn. He can kill our cattle. He can write threats on our walls. But he is not going to win, because I will die before I let him touch you. Caleb, I mean it." He rested his forehead against hers. "I have lost too much in my life. I am not going to lose you too." She kissed him then, hard and desperate with all the fear and love and need that had been building between them for weeks. He responded with equal intensity, his hands in her hair, his body pressed against hers. When they finally broke apart, both of them were trembling. "Lillian," he said raggedly, "we should not. Not tonight. Not like this. I know what I want." She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "I want you. Not because I'm afraid. Not because I need protection. Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, there were tears on his lashes. "I have been waiting my whole life to hear someone say that to me," he said. "And mean it. I mean it." He kissed her again, softer this time, and she knew, without doubt, that whatever happened next, they would face it together. But when they began to move toward the bedroom, when his hands found the buttons of her dress and her fingers worked at his shirt, something happened. His hand closed around her wrist, gentle but firm, and suddenly she was not in Montana anymore. She was in Philadelphia. She was on the floor of her bedroom. Thomas was holding her down, his breath stinking of whiskey, his fist raised. She screamed. Caleb let go instantly, stepping back, his face stricken. "Lillian, I am sorry. I did not mean to. I was not thinking." She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "It is not you. It is him. He is still in my head." Caleb knelt in front of her, not touching, just present. "Then we wait," he said, "as long as you need. I am not going anywhere. What if I am never ready? Then we are never ready." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. "I did not marry you for that. I married you because I was lonely and you seemed kind. And now I am staying because I love you." "You love me?" "I thought that was obvious." Despite everything, she found herself laughing. A watery, broken laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. "We are quite a pair," she said. "Two broken people hiding from the world. Maybe we can be broken together," he said. "And maybe, someday, we can help each other heal." She squeezed his hand. "I would like that." They spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess Silas had made. They did not talk about what had happened. They did not need to. But as dawn broke over the mountains, Lillian made a decision. She was done being a victim, done being afraid. Whatever it took, she was going to fight back. And she was going to win. The days after the break-in were tense and watchful. Caleb barely slept, spending his nights patrolling the property, his days fortifying their defenses. He installed new locks on the doors, boarded up windows, stashed weapons throughout the house. Lillian helped where she could, but she could see the toll it was taking on him. The shadows under his eyes grew darker, the lines around his mouth deeper, and the nightmares got worse. Every night now, he woke screaming Mary's name. Every night, Lillian held him through the terror, felt him shaking in her arms. One morning, after a particularly bad night, she found him in the barn, drunk. He was sitting on a hay bale, staring at the torn wanted poster she had found weeks ago. His face was hollow, haunted. "Caleb," she said softly. He did not look up. "I cannot protect you." "What?" "I thought I could. I thought I was different now. Better. But I am the same man I was 7 years ago. The same man who kills innocent people. That is not true. Is it not?" He finally met her eyes, and the pain there took her breath away. "Silas is right. I took his wife from him. I took his child. Why should I get to be happy when they are dead?" Lillian crossed to him and took the bottle from his hand. She set it aside and knelt in front of him. "Listen to me," she said. "You made a terrible mistake, a tragedy. But that does not define who you are. You have spent 7 years punishing yourself. Is that not enough? It will never be enough. Then let me ask you this." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "If the situation were reversed, if I had done something terrible by accident, would you think I deserve to suffer forever? That is different. Why? Because you are good, you are innocent. I stole $2,000 from my in-laws. I ran away from everything I knew. I lied to you about my past." She stroked his cheek with her thumb. "None of us are innocent, Caleb. But we can be forgiven, if we let ourselves." He stared at her for a long moment. Then something in his expression cracked. "I am so tired," he whispered. "So tired of carrying this." "Then put it down. Let me help you carry it." He pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. But she did not complain. She held him back just as fiercely. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I did not think I could love anyone again, but I love you. I know. I love you too." They stayed like that for a long time. When they finally pulled apart, something had changed. The wall behind Caleb's eyes, the one that had been there since the day she met him, was gone. In its place was something raw and vulnerable and real. "No more secrets," he said. "Whatever happens, we face it together." "Together," she agreed. That afternoon, Caleb took her to the ridge overlooking the ranch. From there, they could see the whole valley spread out below them. The house, the corrals, the pastures dotted with cattle. "My father built this place from nothing," Caleb said. "When he came here, there was nothing but grass and mountains. He worked every day of his life to create something that would last. It is beautiful. It is all I have left of them. My parents. Their dream." He looked at her. "And now I have you, and our dream." "What is our dream?" He was quiet for a moment. "A family," he said finally. "Children. A life without fear." He paused. "I know that might not be possible. I know Silas is out there and Victor is still hunting you. But I want it. I want it more than I have ever wanted anything." "I want it too," Lillian said. "And we are going to have it. We just have to get through this first." As if on cue, a horse and rider appeared on the road below. They both tensed, but as the figure came closer, Lillian recognized the familiar shape of Mrs. Patterson. "Something is wrong," she said. They rode down to meet her. Mrs. Patterson's face was pale with worry. "There is news from town," she said. "Silas Kane has been talking, telling everyone who will listen about what happened 7 years ago, about Mary, about Caleb." Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. What exactly is he saying? That Caleb murdered his wife? That he hunted her down and shot her in cold blood? Mrs. Patterson looked at Caleb with sympathy. "I know it is not true, but people are starting to talk." Let them talk, Caleb said. His voice was hard. I have nothing to hide. There is more. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. Silas has been meeting with Emmett Cole. They have been seen together at the saloon talking for hours. I knew it, Caleb said. I knew that snake was involved. What does Emmett have to do with any of this? Lillian asked. I am not sure, Mrs. Patterson admitted, but whatever they are planning, it cannot be good. After Mrs. Patterson left, Caleb was quiet and brooding. Lillian watched him pace the house like a caged animal. We should go on the offensive, she said finally. What do you mean? I mean, we have been waiting for Silas to make his move, reacting to whatever he does. But what if we did something instead? Like what? I do not know yet. But there has to be something. Some weakness we can exploit. Silas is not invincible. He is just a man, a dangerous man. So are you, Lillian said. You were a bounty hunter. You tracked outlaws for years. You must know how to find people, how to learn their secrets. Caleb looked at her with something like surprise. You want me to hunt him? I want us to hunt him, together. He was quiet for a long moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator. All right, he said. Let us hunt. Over the next few days, they gathered information. Caleb rode into town and talked to people who remembered Silas from years ago. Lillian visited Mrs. Patterson and listened to the gossip that flowed through the boarding house. Piece by piece, they assembled a picture. Silas Kane had not always been an outlaw. He had grown up on a farm in Kansas, the son of a preacher. He had married Mary when they were both young, barely 20. For a few years, they had been happy. Then something changed. No one knew exactly what. But Silas started drinking, started getting violent. Mary stopped coming into town, stopped seeing her friends, and then, one night, she disappeared. The official story was that she ran off, that she abandoned her husband. But some people whispered that Silas had killed her and hidden the body. That was when Silas turned outlaw. Robberies at first, then worse. He became known for his cruelty, his willingness to kill without hesitation. Men said he had no conscience, that he was already dead inside. She was trying to escape him, Lillian said when she heard the story. Mary. She was running away from her own husband. That is what it sounds like, Caleb agreed. Then you did not hunt her into the darkness. He did, by being the kind of man she had to run from. Caleb was silent, processing this. It does not change what happened, he said finally. I still pulled the trigger. No. But it changes who is responsible. She took his hand. Silas is not hunting you because you killed his wife. He is hunting you because he cannot face the truth, that he drove her away, that she would rather die in the wilderness than stay with him. You really believe that? I do. And I think deep down he believes it too. That is why he is so desperate to destroy you, because if he can blame you, he does not have to blame himself. Caleb looked at her with something like wonder. How did you get so wise? I had a lot of time to think. When Thomas was hurting me, I used to lie awake at night and try to understand why, what I had done wrong, what I could do differently. She paused. It took me years to realize that it was never about me. It was about him, about what was broken inside him. And you think the same is true of Silas? I know it is. That night, for the first time in weeks, Caleb did not have nightmares. He slept peacefully in Lillian's arms, his face relaxed, the tension gone from his body. And Lillian lay awake, thinking. She had learned something important about Silas Kane, about what drove him, what haunted him. Knowledge was power, and she intended to use it. The next morning, she told Caleb her plan. We need proof, she said, that Mary was running from Silas, that she was afraid of him. If we can find that, we can destroy his whole story. Where would we find proof like that? Lillian thought about it. She had a sister. Mary did. I heard someone mention it in town. The sister might know something. Caleb nodded slowly. I can track her down, find out where she lives, and I will keep gathering information here. Someone in this town knows the truth about what happened to Mary. We just have to find them. They set to work. Caleb sent telegrams, made inquiries, used the skills he had learned as a bounty hunter. Lillian talked to every woman in town, listened to every scrap of gossip, pieced together the story of Mary Kane's short, tragic life. And slowly, the truth began to emerge. Mary had been afraid of her husband, terrified. She had confided in her sister, had written letters describing the abuse. She had tried to leave once before, had made it as far as the next town before Silas tracked her down and brought her back. The second time she ran, she was pregnant. Desperate. She had hidden in the woods, hoping to make it to her sister's house. But she never got there. We need those letters, Lillian said. The ones she wrote to her sister. If we can get them, we can prove that Silas was the real monster. Her sister lives in Oregon, Caleb said. I sent a telegram asking if she would be willing to share them. I have not heard back yet. When you do, it will change everything. If I do. She might not want to help. Might not want to dredge up old memories. She will, Lillian said with certainty. Mary was her sister. She deserves justice. Even 7 years late. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Oregon. Caleb's hands were shaking as he opened it. She says yes, he said. His voice was unsteady. She will send the letters. She wants people to know what Silas did, what kind of man he really was. Lillian felt a surge of triumph. Then we wait, and when the letters arrive, we destroy him. But Silas Kane was not going to wait for them to make the first move. That night there was a knock at the door. Caleb answered it, his gun in his hand. Emmett Cole stood on the porch looking nervous. I need to talk to you, Emmett said. It is important. Why should I listen to anything you have to say? Because Silas is planning something big. And if you do not stop him, you are both going to die. Caleb stared at him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. You have 5 minutes, he said. Talk. Emmett Cole sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between Caleb and Lillian. Start from the beginning, Caleb said. His voice was hard, unforgiving. Silas approached me a few weeks ago, Emmett said, right after he arrived in town. He knew about my interest in your land, said he could help me get it. All I had to do was keep him informed about your movements. Let him know when you left the ranch, things like that. You sold us out, Lillian said flatly. Emmett flinched. I did not think anyone would get hurt. I thought he just wanted to scare you, make you leave so I could buy the land. And the fire? Caleb asked. The cattle? The message on our wall? I did not know about any of that until after it happened. Emmett's voice was shaking now, and by then it was too late. Silas made it clear that if I stopped helping him, he would tell everyone I was involved. My reputation would be ruined. So you kept helping him. I did not have a choice. There is always a choice, Lillian said. You just chose the cowardly one. Emmett looked at her with something like shame. You are right. I know you are right, but I am trying to make it right now. That is why I am here. Caleb leaned forward. What is Silas planning? He is going to attack the ranch tomorrow night. He has hired 2 men, gunfighters from up north. They are supposed to create a distraction while Silas takes Mrs. Thornton. Lillian felt her blood run cold. Takes me where? Back to Victor Hartley. Emmett swallowed hard. But I do not think she would make it that far. Silas wants you dead, Caleb. And once he has what he wants, I think he will kill her too, just to hurt you. The kitchen was silent. Lillian could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Why are you telling us this? Caleb asked finally. Because I am not a murderer. Emmett's voice cracked. I am greedy. I am selfish. But I am not a killer, and I cannot stand by while innocent people die." Caleb studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to go back to Silas and pretend nothing has changed. Tomorrow night, when the attack starts, you are going to help us. And if you betray us again, I will kill you myself." Emmett nodded rapidly. "I understand. I swear I will not let you down." After he left, Lillian turned to Caleb. "Do you trust him?" "Not even a little. But we need every advantage we can get. If he is telling the truth, we can be ready for them. If he is lying, at least we know something is coming." "What do we do?" Caleb's expression was grim. "We prepare for war." They spent the next day fortifying the ranch. Caleb positioned weapons throughout the house. Lillian practiced shooting until her arms ached. They mapped out escape routes, established signals, prepared for every contingency they could think of. That night, they did not sleep. They sat together on the porch watching the stars wheel overhead. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Caleb said, "I want you to know something." "What?" "These past weeks with you have been the best of my life, even with everything that has happened, even with Silas and Victor and all of it. I would not trade a single day." Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder. "Neither would I. If something goes wrong tomorrow," he continued, "I want you to run. Do not look back. Do not try to help me. Just run." "No, Lillian, no." She turned to face him. "We face this together. Whatever happens, I am done running." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he kissed her, slow and deep. "All right," he said when they finally pulled apart. "Together." The next evening, as the sun began to set, Emmett arrived at the ranch. His face was tight with nerves. "They are coming," he said. "An hour, maybe less." Caleb nodded. "Remember the plan. When the shooting starts, you stay out of the way. After it is over, you tell the sheriff everything. And if we lose, then you tell him anyway. At least then Silas will face justice." The waiting was the hardest part. Lillian positioned herself by the window, the small pistol heavy in her hand. Caleb was at the door, his rifle ready. The sun set. Darkness fell. The night sounds rose around them. Crickets, wind, the distant howl of a coyote, and then gunfire. It came from the barn, bright flashes in the darkness. Caleb cursed and moved toward the door. "They are trying to draw us out," he said. "Stay here." "No. If we split up, they win." More gunfire, shouting. Then the sound of hoofbeats coming fast. "Here they come," Caleb said. Two riders burst into the yard, guns blazing. Caleb returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. One of the riders fell. The other wheeled his horse and came straight at the house. Lillian raised her pistol and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make the rider veer off course. Caleb's next shot took him out of the saddle. Silence fell. The gun smoke drifted away on the breeze. "Is that all of them?" Lillian asked. "No," Caleb's voice was tight. "Silas is not here. These were just the hired guns. Then where is he? Behind you." The voice came from the darkness at the back of the house. Lillian spun around and found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. Silas Kane stepped out of the shadows. His face was twisted with triumph. "Did you really think I would come at you head on?" He clicked his tongue. "I expected better from you, Caleb." "Let her go," Caleb said. His rifle was aimed at Silas, but Silas had Lillian between them. "Put down the gun, or I kill her right now." A long moment of silence. Then Caleb lowered his rifle. Smart man. Silas moved forward, keeping Lillian in front of him like a shield. "Now, we are going to walk out of here, all three of us, and you are going to watch while I take everything from you, just like you took everything from me." "Mary was running from you," Lillian said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "She was trying to escape. She was afraid of you. Shut up." She wrote letters to her sister, describing what you did to her, how you beat her, how you threatened to kill her. I said, "Shut up." You drove her into the darkness that night. Not Caleb, you. Everything that happened is because of what you did to her. Silas's hand was shaking now. The gun wavered. "She loved me," he said. His voice cracked. "She was mine. She was not yours. She was not anyone's property. She was a person, and you destroyed her." Something broke in Silas's expression. For just a moment, his grip loosened. Lillian moved. She threw herself sideways, out of the line of fire. Silas's gun went off, but the shot went wide. Before he could recover, Caleb was on him. They grappled in the darkness, two men fighting for their lives. Lillian scrambled for her pistol, but she could not get a clear shot. Then Silas pulled a knife. He slashed at Caleb, opening a gash across his arm. Caleb staggered back, and Silas pressed his advantage, driving him toward the wall. Lillian did not think. She picked up the rifle Caleb had dropped and swung it like a club. The stock connected with Silas's skull with a sickening crack. He went down and did not get up. Caleb stood there, breathing hard, blood dripping from his arm. "Is he dead?" Lillian asked. "No, just unconscious." "Good." She dropped the rifle and ran to Caleb, wrapping her arms around him. "I want him to face justice. I want everyone to know what he really is." Caleb held her tight. "It is over," he said. "It is finally over." But even as he said the words, they both knew there was still one more battle to fight. Victor Hartley was still out there, still hunting, still waiting for his chance at revenge. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight they had survived. Tonight they had won. And tomorrow they would face whatever came next. Together. The aftermath of the attack was chaos. The sheriff arrived at dawn with a posse of men. They found Silas Kane tied to a post in the barn, still unconscious. The two hired gunmen were dead. Emmett Cole was sitting on the porch, pale and shaking, ready to tell everything. Mrs. Patterson came too, bringing bandages and food and her steady, calming presence. She tended to Caleb's arm while the sheriff took statements. "Silas Kane will stand trial in the territorial court," the sheriff said. "With what Emmett is telling us and the evidence we have gathered, he will be going to prison for a long time." "What about Victor Hartley?" Lillian asked. "He hired Silas. He's the one behind all of this." The sheriff shook his head. "There is no proof that would stand up in court. Everything went through Silas. Hartley was careful to keep his hands clean. So he just gets away with it?" "I did not say that." The sheriff smiled grimly. "I said there is no legal proof, but there are other kinds of justice." "What do you mean?" "Let me handle it. I have some contacts back east. Journalists who would be very interested in a story about a wealthy Philadelphia lawyer who hired outlaws to hunt down his dead brother's widow. Even if we cannot put him in jail, we can destroy his reputation. That would have to be enough." Lillian nodded slowly. As the days passed, the ranch slowly returned to normal. Caleb's arm healed. The damage from Silas's attacks was repaired. Life went on. But something had changed between Caleb and Lillian. They had faced death together, had fought side by side, had saved each other's lives. There was no more distance between them now, no more walls. One evening, about a week after the attack, Lillian found Caleb on the porch, staring at the sunset. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Mary." Lillian's heart clenched. "Do you want to talk about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think about her every day. Every night. I could not escape the memory of what I did. And now? Now I think about her differently." He turned to look at Lillian. "You were right. About Silas. About what really happened that night." Mary was running from him. She was trying to save herself and her baby. What happened to her was a tragedy. But it was not my fault. His voice broke slightly. For 7 years, I carried that guilt. Let it poison everything. And now, for the first time, I feel like I can let it go. Lillian took his hand. "You deserve to be free of it." "I want to visit her grave," Caleb said. "Mary's. I found out where she's buried, a small cemetery outside the town where it happened. I want to pay my respects, to say goodbye. Then let us go. Together." They left the next morning, riding east toward the place where it had all begun. The journey took 2 days through mountains and valleys and vast stretches of empty land. On the third day, they reached the cemetery. It was a small place, overgrown with wildflowers. Mary's grave was in a corner marked with a simple wooden cross. Someone had planted roses beside it, but they had gone wild, sprawling across the ground in a tangle of thorns and blooms. Caleb knelt beside the grave. He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. "I am sorry," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I am sorry I could not save you. I am sorry for what happened that night." He paused, gathering himself. "But I want you to know something. The man who hurt you, who drove you into the darkness, he is going to pay for what he did. Not because of me, because of his own cruelty, because the truth always comes out eventually." He placed a hand on the grave marker. "I hope you have found peace. I hope you are somewhere safe and warm and loved. And I hope you can forgive me for not being able to give you that in life." He stood, wiping his eyes. Lillian came to stand beside him, taking his hand. "She would have liked you," Caleb said. "Mary. She was kind. She saw the good in people. Then she would have understood. What you did was an accident. What Silas did was a choice." He nodded slowly. "I know that now. I finally know that." They stood there together, watching the sun set over the little cemetery. And when darkness fell, they left, riding back toward their ranch, their home, their future. 3 weeks later, a package arrived from Oregon. Inside were Mary's letters. Lillian read them aloud to Caleb, her voice steady, despite the tears running down her face. They painted a picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare, desperate to escape, willing to risk everything for freedom. The final letter had been written the night Mary died. She never got to send it, but her sister had kept it all these years, hoping someone would finally hear the truth. "I am leaving tonight. I do not know if I will make it. Silas has threatened to kill me if I try to run again, and I believe him. But I cannot stay. I cannot let my baby grow up in this house with this monster. If you are reading this, it means I made it, or it means I did not. And someone found this letter among my things. Either way, I want you to know. I did not give up. I fought until the very end." Caleb was silent for a long time after she finished reading. Then he said, "We need to make sure everyone knows about what kind of man Silas really was, about what he did to Mary." "We will," Lillian said. "The letters will be evidence at his trial, and afterward we will make sure the story gets told." The trial of Silas Kane took place a month later. It was the biggest event the territory had seen in years. People came from miles around to watch. The evidence was overwhelming. Emmett Cole testified about the conspiracy to attack the ranch. The letters from Mary described years of abuse. Witnesses came forward who had seen Silas beat his wife, who had heard her cries, who had done nothing. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was 25 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. As they led Silas away, he turned and looked at Caleb. His eyes were empty, hollow. "You took everything from me," he said. Caleb shook his head. "No. You did that yourself. I just made sure you faced the consequences, and then Silas was gone, and it was truly over." The news about Victor Hartley came a few weeks later. Just as the sheriff had promised, the story had made its way to newspapers back east. A wealthy lawyer who hired outlaws to hunt a widow. The scandal destroyed him. He lost his practice, his clients, his standing in society. The last anyone heard, he had fled Philadelphia in disgrace, his fortune and reputation in ruins. "Justice," Lillian said when she heard the news. "Maybe not the legal kind, but justice nonetheless." "Is it enough?" Caleb asked. She thought about it. Thought about Thomas, who had hurt her for years, about Victor, who had hunted her across a continent, about all the people who had tried to break her. "Yes," she said finally, "it is enough, because I am still here. I am still standing, and I am not afraid anymore." Caleb pulled her into his arms. "Neither am I." And for the first time in either of their lives, it was the truth. 1 year later. The ranch had changed in the 12 months since Silas Kane was sent to prison. The barn had been rebuilt, bigger and better than before. The herd had grown. New fences marked the boundaries of the expanded property. But the biggest change was inside the house. It was no longer a bachelor's home, stark and bare. Lillian had transformed it into something warm and welcoming. Curtains on the windows, rugs on the floors, photographs on the walls, and in the corner of the bedroom, a cradle. Lillian stood at the window, watching Caleb work with the horses in the corral below. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the flutter of movement inside. 5 months, Dr. Whitmore had said at her last visit. 5 months until you meet your little one. She had not told Caleb yet, had been waiting for the right moment. And now, watching him move with easy grace among the animals, she knew the time had come. She walked down to the corral, moving carefully on the uneven ground. Caleb looked up at her approach, and his face lit with the smile that still made her heart skip. "Taking a break?" he asked. "I wanted to talk to you." Something in her voice must have caught his attention because his smile faded into concern. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine. Better than fine." She took his hand and placed it on her belly. "Can you feel that?" He went very still. "Lillian, are you saying what I think you are saying? We are going to have a baby." The expression on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Joy, wonder, a love so deep it brought tears to his eyes. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Our baby." He dropped to his knees right there in the corral, pressing his face against her belly. She felt him laughing and crying at the same time, his shoulders shaking. "I never thought I would have this," he said, his voice muffled. "A family, a real family. Neither did I." He looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "I love you," he said. "I love you so much it hurts. I love you too." He stood and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Around them the horses snorted and stamped, unimpressed by the human drama. "We should tell Mrs. Patterson," Lillian said when they finally broke apart. "She will want to start planning. She will want to take over, you mean? Probably. But I do not mind. She is family now." They walked back to the house hand in hand. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air smelled of sage and pine and home. That night they sat on the porch the way they had so many nights before. But this time everything felt different. Bigger. More real. "I want to ask you something," Lillian said. "Anything. That first day, when I arrived. You asked me how long. And I cried. Do you remember? Every day. I could not answer you then. I did not know how to explain, but I can now." She turned to face him fully. 26 years. That is how long I was hurt. From the day I was born, when my mother died giving me life, through the years with my aunt who did not want me, through my marriage to Thomas. I was hurt for 26 years, Caleb. Until the day I met you. He was silent, listening. "You asked me how long, and I thought you were asking about my ribs. But now I understand. You were asking about everything, all of it. And the answer is my whole life. Until you." His hand found hers in the darkness. "I was hurt too," he said, "for longer than I knew. I thought the pain of what I did to Mary was my punishment, that I deserved to suffer forever. But you showed me that was not true. You showed me that accidents do not define us, that we can be forgiven, that we can forgive ourselves. We healed each other," Lillian said. "We did. So my question now is different." She squeezed his hand. "How long will you love me?" Caleb took her face in his hands, the way he had so many times before. "Longer than I have left on this earth," he said. "And if there is something after this life, I will find you there and start over. I will love you in every world, Lillian, every lifetime, forever." She smiled, tears streaming down her face. "That is a good answer. I have had a year to think about it." She kissed him, tasting salt and sweetness and home. And somewhere in a small cemetery far away, the wild roses bloomed on Mary Kane's grave. And perhaps if such things were possible, she smiled too. Because the man who had taken her life by accident had found peace at last, had found love, had found redemption. And that, in the end, was enough. The church in Montana City had never looked so beautiful. Autumn flowers decorated the pews. Candles flickered in the windows. The whole town had turned out to witness the wedding of Caleb Thornton and Lillian Gray. Yes, another wedding. But this one was different. The first wedding had been a business arrangement, cold and distant. This one was a celebration. Lillian stood before the mirror in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, wearing a white dress that skimmed over her growing belly. Her mother's handkerchief was tucked into her bouquet, the worn cotton soft against the flowers. Mrs. Patterson stood behind her, fussing with her hair. "You look beautiful," the older woman said. "Different from when you first arrived. I feel different. You have changed." Lillian shook her head. "Number one, I am finally who I was supposed to be. I just needed to stop running long enough to find out." The ceremony was simple but perfect. Dr. Whitmore officiated, his voice warm with affection for the couple he had watched find each other. Mrs. Patterson stood as witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. When the preacher asked if Lillian took Caleb as her husband, she said, "I already did, a year ago. But this time, I mean it with my whole heart." When he asked Caleb the same question, Caleb said, "I have been hers since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. The rest was just waiting for both of us to figure it out." The town cheered when they kissed, and this time, it was not a handshake. It was a promise. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. People who had once whispered about the mail-order bride now congratulated her warmly, welcomed her as one of their own. As the sun set, Caleb found Lillian standing apart from the crowd, looking out at the mountains. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The future," she said. "Our future. Everything that is waiting for us." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his hands on her belly. "Tell me what you see." "I see our child growing up strong and free. I see more children, maybe. I see the ranch thriving. I see us growing old together, sitting on that porch, watching the sun set just like this." She turned in his arms to face him. "I see home, Caleb. For the first time in my life, I see home." He kissed her forehead. "I see the same thing." They stood there as the light faded, wrapped in each other's arms. Behind them, the town continued to celebrate. Before them, the mountains stood eternal, unchanged by the small dramas of human life. And between them, a new life grew, a promise of everything that was to come. Later that night, back at the ranch, they sat on the porch one last time before going to bed. The stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way a river of light across the sky. "I want to ask you something," Caleb said. "What?" "When you answered my advertisement, what were you hoping to find?" Lillian thought about it. "Safety," she said finally. "That was all I could imagine wanting, a place where no one would hurt me. And now I have so much more than safety. I have love. I have family. I have purpose." She reached over and took his hand. "I have you." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I was hoping to find someone who would not be frightened of me," he said. "Someone who would not run when they learned who I really was, what I had done." "And did you find that?" "I found more. I found someone who saw the worst of me and loved me anyway, who helped me forgive myself, who gave me a reason to keep living. Then we both got more than we hoped for. We did." The wind stirred the grass around the house. In the corral, a horse whickered softly. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote sang to the moon. "We should go inside," Lillian said. "It is getting cold. One more minute." He pulled her closer, and they sat there together, watching the stars wheel overhead. And Lillian thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The pain, the fear, the long journey across a continent, the broken ribs that had been the outward sign of a broken life. She had arrived in Montana with nothing but wounds and secrets and a desperate hope for something better. And she had found it. Found him. Found herself. "Come on," Caleb said finally. "Let us go home." She smiled at the word. "Home." "Yes," she said. "Let us go home." They walked inside together, closing the door on the night. And if anyone had been watching, they would have seen the lamplight warm in the windows, the smoke rising from the chimney, and two shadows moving together, inseparable. A house that had been cold and empty for so long was finally filled with warmth and light and love. A man who had thought he did not deserve happiness had found it anyway. A woman who had spent her life running had finally found a place to stand. And in 5 months, their child would be born into a family built on truth and trust and forgiveness. A child who would never know fear, who would grow up loved and safe and free. The mail-order bride who had arrived with broken ribs had found healing. The cowboy who had asked how long had found his answer, and together they had found something that neither of them had dared to hope for. They had found home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.